I've been watching protests in this city for 30 years. I've been covering events in this city for 30 years. This was not a great day for democracy in Toronto. I saw things I'd never seen before. I saw things that frankly should not have happened. And people will come to their own conclusions about what they believe the state of democracy to be in Toronto and in Canada as a result of what happened. It was a sad, bloody day, I'll tell you that much.
Ontarians deserve answers. Ontarians deserve respect. Ontarians deserve, Speaker, a public inquiry to get to the bottom of what really happened in Toronto during the G20 summit. That is the bottom line. Otherwise, we risk setting a terrible, terrible precedent.
Let's go down the list. Laws were changed without public input. The public was misinformed about broadened police powers. Unconstitutional searches occurred across the city. Excessive force was used to disperse peaceful protesters. More than 1,000 people were arrested, held in an overcrowded detention center, and not allowed to call their family or a lawyer. More than 900 of them had not done anything wrong and were subsequently released without charge. Never have we witnessed before in this province such an outrageous and aggressive attack on fundamental freedoms and on basic and clear charter rights. We reverted to barbarism on June 26, June 27.
You know, Ontarians have paid very dearly over the years for this right to collectively gather and voice their opinions in freedom and without being accosted by law enforcement and police. They've had this right since the founding of our province, Speaker. It must be respected and it must be protected.
Don't be so grouchy. Get
back! Move back!
Police in Quebec are being accused of using undercover agents to provoke violence outside the North American Leaders Summit in Montebello, Quebec, earlier this week. Police are not commenting on the matter, but protest organizers say they have the video evidence to prove it. They claim officers acted as masked demonstrators who attempted to stir up the crowd at a legitimate protest and went way ahead or beyond their duty to keep the peace. CTV's David Aiken reports.
These protesters are not yelling at the lines of uniformed police officers. They're yelling at what they say are 3 undercover officers dressed up like them.
Come on, it's our line! Fuck her off to your line!
A protest leader is worried the 3 will get violent.
Put the rock down, man! Put the rock down!
The 3 refuse to identify themselves.
These 3 guys are cops, everybody!
Other protesters say they are provocateurs trying to start a riot.
They want us to be aggressive with them.
Trapped, the 3 push back and then try to bust the police line and are arrested.
Now, all of that happened on Monday. 2 days later, the Quebec police force refuses to comment on the incident. If anybody was arrested, no police agency is releasing their names or even confirming the arrests. Union officials say that's proof the 3 were police officers or their agents.
In a free and democratic society, people have the right to peacefully protest something they don't like.
Police routinely plant undercover officers at demonstrations, mostly to learn about routes protesters will use or to determine if there are any weapons. Information police say they need to ensure everyone's safety. This retired officer is skeptical the 3 were police officers. He says in his 25 years of policing protests, he's never seen undercover officers act in such a clumsy and dangerous manner.
I'm finding it very difficult to believe that any police commander for any police service would ever sanction that kind of an intelligence operation.
No. Put the rock down, man! Put the rock down! Hey! Put the rock down! This is our line! Get out of town! Cops out of town!
Communications, Energy and Paper Workers Union President Dave Coles was confronting these 3 masked men with rocks and bottles and accusing them of being police officers. You can see from this footage that they were intent on starting a riot. Watch as the gloved hand of one of these provocateurs hits a member of the riot squad in the face mask. Now watch as he changes hands with the rock and then bangs it into a riot shield. These masked men were attempting to violently disrupt an otherwise peaceful protest. They were breaking the law and violating the constitutionally guaranteed rights of the protesters.
They're trying to create a riot so that they can suck us all in to get beat up.
They're people off.
How do you know? I stopped him. Looked him in his eye and said, "You're a cop, aren't you?" And his eyes just glazed right up. I tried to take his mask off. We took it off. We got pictures. They're provocateurs.
The action of these three masked men and the reaction of the riot squad was highly suspect, but ultimately it was the matching boots that gave the provocateurs away. That night I posted the footage on YouTube. For the next 4 days, it was a national and international news story. The Sûreté de Quebec denied any involvement, but on the fourth day, they finally admitted it was their officers.
As we confirmed yesterday, the three people in question were indeed Sûreté de Quebec police officers performing their duties.
These three guys are cops, everybody!
Busted. 3 Quebec provincial police officers, identities masked, one carrying a huge rock.
Hey, put the rock down!
Nabbed for infiltrating a peaceful protest at Montebello. The tip-off came from a union leader who noticed riot police standing by despite the obvious weapon. He accused the men of being undercover cops trying to provoke a riot and end the protest. The men were removed but never charged. After 2 days of questions, the Sûreté de Québec issued a news release late today confirming, yes, the men are police officers, but denying they were agents provocateurs, claiming they were sent in to identify and stop trouble. They say the police refused to throw stones, committed no crime, and were there to maintain order and security.
Wait a second. This is not a proper use of police resources, and we should be setting guidelines.
Activists have argued for years that police try to thwart their legal right to protest by trying to incite aggression so they can move in and take protesters away. They say they do it even when demonstrators gather in a designated area, as these mostly unionists were in Montebello. And they say politicians tacitly endorse it.
This is the face of it, where people can't even ask a question without having to face these kinds of goons.
The Supreme Court has ruled protesters have the right to be seen and heard. Tonight, both the Quebec and federal governments are facing calls to do more to police the police. Susan Bonner, CBC News, Ottawa.
It's being called Fortress Toronto. Several downtown blocks of Canada's largest and most populous city have been wrapped in more than 6 kilometers of zinc-coated fencing. Pounding the pavements in and around the 3-meter-tall barriers are thousands of officers who are keeping a watchful eye out for any potential threats as the leaders of the world's largest economies meet in Toronto for the G20 summit. The billion-dollar price tag for security alone is a controversy the government is struggling to contain.
So many things could have been done with that money. And am I upset? Yes, I'm upset.
Good afternoon. As of right now, if you need to be downtown, you need to be ready to identify yourself.
That's right, because police have some new powers. If you are within 5 meters of the outside of the security fence, you're going to be asked for ID. If you refuse, you can walk away and leave the area, but if you refuse and you stay, you could be arrested. CTV's Paul Bliss joins us now from Queen's Park. Paul, you were just down at police headquarters where Chief Blair was speaking with reporters, and the chief says these arrest powers are not new. They go back to perhaps 1939.
Yeah, the chief and I had a bit of an exchange going this morning because I was trying to get clarification from him. The act that grants the police these powers has been in effect for decades. However, these powers were only granted to police on June the 2nd. But the problem was it was done without police or the government notifying anybody. Essentially what happened is the chief went to the politicians, the Liberal government at Queen's Park, and said, I need special permission under an act that the government has It's called the Public Works Protection Act. He says, I want to be able to arrest anyone within 5 meters of the fence if they don't provide proper identification, if they don't allow me to do a search.
We know that securing Toronto city centre against all those anarchists and terrorists can get very boring, so we are here to remind you that everything is okay, that we are on your side. We are the love police, and our job is to lower fear and raise love.
We can ask them to leave, and as you all now know, we have the authority to ask them to leave the interior of the perimeter area and then 5 meters from that fence.
You're within 5 meters of this wall, so please turn off your video camera.
We can't film within 5 meters of the wall?
No, that's correct.
Okay.
Public Works Act states that, so please.
Because
we're show your identification to these officers.
Failure to identify yourself under the Public Works Act is going to end up in you guys being arrested.
They will not be arrested. They have a right to not identify themselves. Again, I would invite you to read the act because what you're saying is not true.
Right? So,
Is he being detained right now, or
he's just talking? Same thing that I've asked you to stop filming, brother. Come on.
Let me clarify it for you. By all means, if someone comes to the fence and seeks entry, they will be asked to identify themselves. If they refuse, and they have a right to refuse, then they may leave. And they will leave without being arrested. If, on the other hand, they try to force their way in, they can be prevented from entering. That's a very different thing than what you have described.
Okay, so your friend didn't want to tell the police who he was, so he's been arrested for the time being, okay? All right, right now he's just been arrested.
So what's the arrest for?
For failing to identify himself.
On Tuesday, it emerged that special police powers that the media reported had been given to police for the duration of the summit, powers that the Globe and Mail suggested were unlimited, had in fact never been given. Although a temporary regulation was passed in secret on June 2nd, making the fenced-off security zone around the summit subject to the Ontario Public Works Protection Act, the so-called 5-meter zone that supposedly gave police the right to demand identification from anyone within 5 meters of the fence never existed. When asked on Tuesday if the 5-meter rule had been in effect, Toronto Police Chief Bill Blair said, quote, "No, but I was trying to keep the criminals out," end quote.
There's no official protest here today yet. The big one is tomorrow, but already we're seeing some evidence that police are using that new power that they have under the new regulation. Joining us now is Tara. You were here in the park earlier. What happened to you? Did police say something about this new rule?
Well, basically, we had just met in the middle of the park. We sat down to exchange some phone numbers, and within about 10 seconds, about 10 police officers had surrounded us, had basically asked us to open our bags so they could search them. And my two friends said they did not consent to the search, and they enacted basically the new Public Works Act. And said, you have to basically open your bags and we have to be able to search them. So they searched our bags, also asked for identification, and wrote down all of our identification as well as phone numbers.
When they mentioned this new Public Works Act, what did they say about it? Did they say, well, we can arrest you, or what?
They basically told us that it allowed them to open anything and search anything on public grounds. As to what public grounds means, they weren't really clear, but they said anything that was considered a public place, they could ask for identification and could search us. But there's no protesters in the park today, and so I was just kind of shocked that 10 police were surrounding us when we were writing down phone numbers.
Well, what about the fact that there is no fence here? I mean, a lot of the explanation was that if you're within 5 meters of the fence, you could be searched. There's no fence here.
I'm not sure why exactly we were searched, and in fact, there was no fence here. I haven't seen a fence for at least a couple kilometers, so I'm not quite sure why we're being searched here or why there is so much police presence, but we definitely, this act was invoked on us.
What this legislation does on its face is that it gives the police the authority to ask a citizen to identify themselves who happen to be in downtown Toronto, and they've designated a whole area in downtown Toronto, and to have a police with the authority to force you to identify yourself without any cause whatever is frightening. And then it goes on to give them authority to search the person without any cause.
Which means the whole right to privacy and right to probable cause is gone on the search. You just have to be within an area.
Within that approach, as it's called.
As we'll learn later, that's a pretty flexible thing. Just what is that area?
That's right. So they could designate, for example, the whole of downtown Toronto as a public work, and then public protest would be prohibited.
I think it's kind of also extraordinary that it's not just police officers who can enforce this act. It's something they're calling guards. But the most important thing that then leads to is every person who gets appointed this way has the powers of a peace officer. They can turn almost anybody they want into a policeman.
That's right. And of course, we saw earlier this week or the previous week where there were a number of private security people that were going to come to Toronto to deal with the G20, and they weren't even licensed in Ontario, so that we've got people here that could be not licensed or they're quickly licensed. In other words, if people read that if they went downtown to protest, that some rent-a-cop guard could arrest them for whatever, neglecting to follow their instructions, then people may say, you know what, I don't need that. I think I'll stay home and so on. So the chilling effect is also crucial.
So the right of free assembly can be gone in a snap of cabinet's fingers?
In effect, a snap of cabinet's fingers behind closed doors.